Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is brought to you by MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 234, A Masterpiece of Villainy.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hi, and welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you look a little villainous this morning as you twirl your mustache at me.
Yes, it's true. Well, it's part of my overall transformation. I've decided that I've spent far too many years as Burt Wolder, amiable Sherlockian, and now it's time for me to evolve and transform into Burt Wolder, artist collective. And then I can sell an NFT.
There you go, an NFT.
And I want to be part of what's going on. I mean, look, earlier this morning I took a coin and I tried to take a bite out of it because I've read about this Bitcoin thing. And I think people who do that billions of times deserve all the profit. It's really hard.
Bitcoin. I see what you did there. Wow. That's a minor undertaking, as they say. Well, we are not here to talk about crypto. We are here to talk about, well, not even things cryptic. We are here to talk with Ross Davies and Ira Matetsky about the latest BSI Press manuscript book, A Masterpiece of Villainy, which is the manuscript of the Norwood Builder. It's a fascinating conversation that we're in for, and we hope you will stay tuned for it. First, we need to remind you that the show notes for this episode can be found at ihose.co/ihose234. Wow, it's wonderful how those numbers just roll off the tongue. That's all lowercase, ihose.co/ihose234. That'll take you to the ihearofsherlock.com website, where you can find all kinds of things in addition to the show notes here. We'll have links to the Green Bag and to the BSI Press and anything else you need to know, including episodes that we will mention in the show, because of course both of our guests have appeared previously on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and their conversations are wonderful to go back and mine. We should also remind you that if you would like to support the show, we would certainly welcome that. You can go to patreon.com/ihearofsherlock, or just hit that orange button in our show notes. That will allow you to support the show for as little as $1 a month. Every contribution helps. It contributes to how we pay for the hosting costs, for the email, for the editing, planning, prize purchasing, everything. Oh, and speaking of prize purchasing, we do have another wonderful prize available for people later in the show, which is, well, you'll have to stay tuned for exactly what that prize is right after the interview. So let's get to it, shall we? Well, we are pleased to welcome back both Ross Davies and Ira Matetsky to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Ross, of course, is a professor. He teaches law at George Mason University. And he edits the Green Bag and its satellites at greenbag.org, including the Baker Street Almanac. And he operates a website featuring Sherlockian maps and toasts at rossdavies.org. He is the head mastiff of the Sons of the Copper Beeches, and he has some sort of role in the ACD Society. Ira Brad Matesky is a New York City Sherlockian whose interests include the publication and bibliographical history of the canon, law and the canon, Sherlockian society history and traditions, and Doylean and Sherlockian poetry. He's had articles in the BSJ, the Serpentine Muse, the Watsonian, and several Scion publications, and, of course, the BSI Press book, Canon Law. He co-edited Upon the Turf, which was published by the BSI Press in 2020 with Candy Lewis, and he's a member of the Adventresses of Sherlock Holmes and the Sons of the Copper Beeches. He co-edited and contributed to the Sherlock Holmes themed editions of the Green Bag Almanac and Reader in 2015 and 2016, and is the canonical annotations editor of the Baker Street Almanac. His other detective fiction activities include serving since 2007 as the Werowance, or president of the Wolf Pack, the literary society for the Nero Wolfe novels by Rex Stout. He's a litigation partner at Ganfor Shore Leeds and Zauderer in Manhattan. Gentlemen, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent.
Very
well,
much so.
We are here once again. It is not January. My gosh, it's February already. But coming out of every January, as it has become a tradition at the BSI weekend and here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, we have new books from the BSI Press. And in this case, the wonderful Manuscript Series continues with the manuscript for the Norwood Builder. Ross, you served as editor for this project, so we're going to start with you, put you on the hot seat. How did this project come about, and how is it that you, of all people, were chosen?
That is a question that I continue to ask myself, and that I suspect the series editors and publishers do as well. All I know is that I got a couple of phone calls from Bob Katz, the co-publisher, and Andy Fusco, the general editor, saying, boy, do we have a deal for you. It involves no money, no sleep, and no joy. But it is a service to the community, and in fact, it was in fact great fun, and sort of ticked along strangely easily from there. Bob and Andy were both great supports. John Bergquist, typically he's the other co-publisher, typically comes in later in the process because he's the production editor. But those three sort of held my elbows, helped carry me along through this process. Starting with, I guess the two other major human institutions involved in the Manuscript Series. So it's sort of Bob and John and Andy, who are the management structure behind it, and then I don't think it's every one of these books, but it feels like it's been every one of these books that Randall Stock writes a fantastic lexicographical, bibliographical history of the manuscript. And Phil Burgum transcribes and annotates the whole darn thing. So in a sense, almost all of the really hard work is done before the volume editor and the commentators get involved.
So when did it start? I mean, for our listeners, who might not be aware of how long it takes on one of these projects. So the book is actually printed and available in January 2022. When was the first, pen put to paper, as it were?
The first phone calls, pen put to paper kind of stuff happened in early 2020 when, they pick an editor, and the editor is, sort of confers with basically Andy Fusco and Bob Katz, brainstorm authors and topics and so on and so forth. And then that basically you have about a year, a bit more than a year, till the spring of the following year to prepare a package to hand off to John Bergquist and Bob Katz. And then they spend the sort of middle months of that year, in this case it would be 2021, putting it in shape. And one of the things that was really brought home to everyone involved in this kind of thing in 2021 was Fusco, Bergquist, and Katz are ferocious about getting things done, not only on time, but early. And it turns out that when there are global supply chain problems that plague the publishing industry terribly, having a book that's going to come out in January done the summer before means that the book really comes out in January. And so the sort of the long tradition of pretty good discipline about scheduling, I think, really paid off for the BSI Press this year. And we owe a thank you. We readers owe a thank you to Andy, Bob, and John for making that happen.
Well, that's an interesting point, Ross. And you are no stranger to the editing and publishing process yourself. I mean, we talked with you the last time you were here on episode 219 about the Baker Street Almanac, and of course your associated publishing empire with the Green Bag in the legal profession. So it's something you're familiar with, the process and whatnot. But what is it specifically about this manuscript that made Bob, John, and Andy turn to you and say, Ross is our man?
I think there were probably a serious point and a more jocular point about this. The more jocular point first, and that is that I'm very malleable. I'm a very obedient guy, right? And I think it's hard to find a Baker Street irregular who is malleable and obedient. So when they come across one, they would just prefer to use them up rather than potentially not. But in all seriousness, a few years ago, the Green Bag produced an annotated version of the Norwood Builder itself, not a manuscript edition version, but in a slightly different context that does not compete with the manuscript volume. I'd already been down this road, and I'd already worked with some of the people who would end up making good contributors for this. And in fact, you've also invited for this show an important one of those in Ira Matetsky, who worked with me on the first Norwood Builder project, and then came back for this one. So I had some history with this particular story that made it make sense.
Talk a little bit about that original annotated version that you did for the Green Bag. I'm fascinated about this, and of course, I think your profession, yours and Ira's, will certainly steer us in that direction.
Yes, you are tactfully touching on the fact that I'm a lawyer, Ira's a lawyer, Holmes's client in Norwood Builder is a lawyer, and if I may, on top of that, and Ira, correct me if I miss anyone on this, but looking at the table of contents for this volume, Andy Fusco is a lawyer, Ross Davies is a lawyer, Ira Matetsky is a lawyer, Mike Homer is a lawyer, Steve McAllister is a lawyer, Cattleya Concepcion is a lawyer, and Jayantika Ganguly is a lawyer. This is a law book.
Well, for the record, I am not a lawyer, nor do I play one on the internet.
But I've hired lawyers. So.
Well, and this is fascinating because this is one of those cases that, while it's not about the law itself, it hinges on certain aspects of the law, certainly of trusts and wills and whatnot. So we'll kind of save that for the second half of the conversation, because really that's the core of the book, getting these lawyers to comment on different aspects of the case. But Ira, I want to turn to you because, as I understand it, you were instrumental in securing the manuscript for this particular book. You know, in the past, we've had generous collectors who have given access to the BSI Press to scan the documents and to really leaf through them. In this case, that wasn't quite the same, was it?
No. This manuscript is owned by the New York Public Library, and specifically a unit of the library called the Berg Collection. And one of the chapters in the book is an interview I did with Carolyn Vega, who has been for the past several years the curator of that collection. By coincidence or otherwise, the New York Public Library building is 5 blocks from my apartment and 3 blocks from my office. So I am in and out of the library all the time. the Berg Collection is a great resource for modern literature, including, but certainly by no means limited to, Arthur Conan Doyle. They hold the manuscripts of 3 of the Sherlock Holmes short stories, which is more than any other institution. They also hold the only complete surviving chapter of The Hound of the Baskervilles. They hold the Lost World manuscript, which has been brought out in both an annotated edition by Wessex Press and a facsimile edition by the Conan Doyle estate. They own a couple of the Brigadier Gerard original manuscripts. They own important letter books of A.P. Watt, the literary agent's literary agent, about the writing of the stories in 1891. They own A.P. Watt's account books, which Ross has used for scholarly work. They own important correspondence between William Gillette and Vincent Starrett, which Susan Dollinger has written about. It's an amazing repository of Conan Doyle items.
Yeah, I understand Glenn Maranker is currently in New York. Has anyone seen him in the proximity of the New York Public Library? And are they watching him closely?
I don't think I'm going to react to that, but what I will say is that one of the very first Manuscript Series volumes long ago was a reprint of, I think it's chapter 11 of The Hound.
That's right.
Which was authorized by Dame Jean Conan Doyle when she was still alive. But subsequently, the Berg Collection was, for a time, they wanted people to come there and use the holdings. They did not necessarily want the holdings copied. And so in 2018, I was doing some unrelated research there. And I was taking copious notes on some Doylean item. And one of the librarians came over to me and said, "Why don't you just take a photograph of that page?" And I said, because my phone is in a locker downstairs pursuant to your policy. I was told we're not allowed to photograph anything. And she said, "Oh, we changed that." And so I said, would it be possible to get copies of some of the Conan Doyle manuscripts? And she said, as long as they are not copyrighted, that should be doable. So this was on a Friday afternoon, and by pure coincidence, the next day I was going to be meeting up with Bob Katz at a Sherlockian event. And chatting with him before the event, I said, "By the way, would it be of interest to you if I could get hold of library quality facsimiles of a couple of manuscripts?" And he said, "From where?" And I said, things like the Norwood Builder from the New York Public Library. And he frowned and said, "Don't waste your time. Those manuscripts are not available." And I said, if that could be changed, would it be of interest? And he and shortly thereafter, Mike Whalen made it very clear that I was authorized and directed to obtain these copies.
That is fantastic. So, first of all, what other Sherlock Holmes manuscripts are in the collection? We've got Chapter 11 of The Hound. We've got the Norwood Builder. Is there another one there?
They've also hold, I believe it's the Devil's Foot and the Blanche Soldier.
Oh, boy. Wow. So that says to me... Go ahead.
And each of them came to the collection through a different and fascinating story, which you'll read about in this book and hopefully in future books.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, that was the second part of the question. Who was Berg and how did the Berg Collection come to be?
The Bergs, plural, were two physicians who were collectors of books, of manuscripts, of associated materials, correspondence, etc., English and American literature, primarily of the 19th and 20th centuries. And they donated their collections to the New York Public Library on condition that it be kept as a separate collection. The Berg Collection has its own lovely room in the main branch of the, I think it's officially called the Schwartzman Building now, of the public library. This manuscript, there were a couple of other people whose collections also made their way into the grander collection. This manuscript, I believe, was contributed by a gentleman named Owen Young. But in the book is a great deal of the background.
That's fantastic. Well, we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we will continue talking with Ross Davies and Ira Matetsky. Stay tuned. MX Publishing recently launched the MX Audio Collection, an app with a series of interviews and other audio content, beginning with Lee Child talking about Reacher and Sherlock. There are many more interviews lined up for 2022, including Jeffrey Hatcher, screenwriter for Mr. Holmes, Otto Penzler, the founder of the Mysterious Bookshop and Mysterious Press, authors like Bonnie McBird and Nicholas Meyer, and yours truly, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder from I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Every month, MX will be adding in at least 4 new Sherlock Holmes stories and some more theater performances. There'll be more from the deductionist Ben Cardall, too. You can read more about the app and sign up for the MX Audio Collection at ihose.co/MXaudio. That's all lowercase, ihose.co/MXaudio. There's a monthly subscription option and an annual subscription option with a significant discount. And iHose listeners get an additional 25% off of any subscription you choose just by using the code iHose when checking out. A percentage of the proceeds of the app go to Undershaw, the School for Children with Learning Disabilities. It was the former home of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course wrote many of the Sherlock Holmes stories while he lived there. So go to ihose.co/MXaudio and use the code iHose today for the MX Audio Collection. All right, we are back talking with 2 reputable BSIs about their contribution to A Masterpiece of Villainy, one of the latest books in the BSI Manuscript Series. Ira was just telling us about his patience and fortitude dealing with the New York Public Library. And those of you who have been there, you understand that I'm referring to the 2 lions that sit perched outside of the main branch there on Fifth Avenue, Patience and Fortitude, so named by Fiorello LaGuardia. Ira, I just want to kind of put a cap on this. When you first saw this manuscript of the Norwood Builder, first of all, were you able to handle it physically, and what was your reaction upon seeing it?
I was able to handle the manuscript physically. My first involvement with the manuscript actually occurred when I was working with Ross, writing a couple of the footnotes for his annotated lawyerly version of the Norwood Builder in the Greenbag Almanac that he mentioned. And that was actually one of the projects that drew me to Sherlock Holmes in the first place. When I was on the program last time, I talked about some other things that were helping to turn me from a casual Sherlockian into whatever it is I am today. But Ross calling me, and I had known Ross for years as a contributor to his law journal, The Greenbag. And when he invited me to write about the Norwood Builder, it came right on top of a number of other things. The whole world was drawing my attention to Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, but that was a big part of it. So I thank Ross for that. And I did take the walk over to the Berg Collection. I won't say that anybody can come in. You have to give them some explanation of some serious scholarly or quasi-scholarly reason you want to use the materials, but working on the almanac qualified, and the manuscript was given to me. It's bound. It's, I believe, 50. One of those little the way Conan Doyle bound his manuscripts after World War I, and you can turn the pages. And you can handle it and you can look at it. The first thing I noted, and it became the basis for one of the footnotes I wrote for Ross, was one of the great things about working with these manuscripts is you can see Conan Doyle's thoughts evolving because he's writing the manuscript in real time, and he didn't have it, we're not seeing it after 4 drafts or after it's been typed up and he's edited it. So you can see there are sentences or words or paragraphs that are crossed out, some of which are of interest. And you can watch the whole evolution. You can look at the manuscript, touch the manuscript. You cannot take it with you.
So, Ira, here's the general question and then an observation. So from the manuscript, what did you learn? What surprised you? But to me, just opening the book and looking at the first page of the manuscript, clearly Conan Doyle, this is the Sherlock Holmes series, and he's identified the title page in that way, The Adventure of the Norwood Builder. And this is the second story, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. He's got Roman numeral 2, and in pencil, somebody's put on 9,500 words. But the cover says, Anno Belli Geminici 4. Why are those words there? And what do they mean?
I believe what that means is the 4th year of the war with Germany, which is when the manuscript would have been bound. In or about 1917 or 1918. There's actually a great story to Conan Doyle's getting his manuscripts from the Return back from the Strand magazine. As a general rule, there are exceptions. Most of the manuscripts pre-hiatus do not survive. Almost all of the manuscripts post-hiatus from the Hound and the Return, the Hound is a special case, but from the Return on do survive. Ross has actually written about how Conan Doyle was able to get the manuscripts back from the Strand.
Now, this manuscript seems to have been typed because somebody, not in Conan Doyle's hand, but on the first page, says 3 copies sent to Sir A.C. Doyle, Undershaw, Hindhead.
Yes. By this point, Conan Doyle had engaged a professional typing service. He would have 3 copies made. I presume that one of them would go to the Strand magazine, where the editors would prepare it for publishing, and one of them would go to whoever had been chosen as the American publisher of that particular story.
Yeah. Well, was there anything in the manuscript, when you looked at it that was surprising to you or, really interesting or unexpected?
There were a couple of crossouts that actually led me to speculate that one of the key plot points of the story is that, this is not a will that would have been taken seriously by lawyers. It should have been clear from the way this happened to Hector MacFarlane that Jonas Oldacre was not serious about this being his will. Either that and or MacFarlane was not a great lawyer. They didn't have 2 witnesses. The one witness was a beneficiary, which was not permitted, et cetera, et cetera. And in looking at the manuscript, there were a couple of changes that led me to believe that Conan Doyle was not necessarily, or Dr. Watson, as the case may be, were not necessarily up on the fine points of the British law of wills either. For more detail, hunt down the lawyerly annotated version, which is available online at Ross's website.
We will have a link to that in our show notes to the Greenbag Almanac. So that'll be handy for people to kind of compare and contrast here. One of the things, and this is free range for either one of you, Ross or Ira, when we look at Conan Doyle manuscripts generally, they are very clean. Conan Doyle seemed to know exactly what the plot points were. He seemed to know exactly what the dialogue would be, what his descriptions would be. And there's a word crossed out here and there, or a phrase that is corrected or inserted, usual editing kind of activities. However, in this manuscript, I noticed something that I haven't picked up in any other Conan Doyle manuscript that's been part of this series yet, and I could be mistaken. On page 15 of the manuscript, which is on pages 42 and 43 of the book, there is an entire half page boxed around and X'd out that Conan Doyle clearly had misgivings about how he stated this part of the case. And in this case, he noted that Jonas Oldacre is a well-known woman hater. That's a loaded phrase right there. But it seemed as if he was giving away too much of the plot point at this point and realized, I need to step back a little and be a little more opaque about what's going on here. At least that was my take. How did you respond to that very different kind of annotation in the manuscript?
Oh, my goodness. Yes, this is, first of all, if I may, and I suspect this is something that many of us who enjoy not only the canon, but poking around with these manuscripts can't help wondering about, which is that Peter Blau has some notes written by the literary agent having to do with the Valley of Fear. Could it really be the case that late in his writing career, Arthur Conan Doyle took up the practice of brainstorming on paper what he was going to put into canonical stories? Or could it be instead the case that he perhaps often scribbled these notes, but didn't bother to save them? Scribble the notes, he'd write the story, he'd toss the notes in the fire and send the story off to the typist. Golly, I would love to be able to rummage through the grate in his fireplace. But yes, this page for me brings to mind Peter Blau's tiny treasure trove of Valley of Fear notes. I think you're right, Scott. I think, in fact, I think your theory is probably the right one. It had not occurred to me that way. Not the fact that I didn't think of it doesn't mean that great minds like your own wouldn't have come up with it early on. But it does have the feel of the writer getting a bit carried away. He's got this great story idea and he gets too far down the track too soon.
Yeah. Now we should tell our readers that what we're talking about here is a really interesting paragraph. So this is, in the story where McFarlane is talking to Holmes and Lestrade is there and the events of this evening are being carried out. And the door was opened for McFarlane by a middle-aged woman who was his housekeeper. And Lestrade has this comment. I mean, this is really, sort of 2.5 paragraphs. Lestrade says, that's a bad shot, McFarlane. Jonas Oldacre is well known as a woman hater. He has no servant except an old charwoman who comes in for 2 hours every morning, and he gets all his meals at the station restaurant. I warn you again that you are only making a bad case worse. Then this will all come out against you. And Watson says, our unfortunate client turned a ghastly color, and he looked from one to the other of us like a hunted creature. Twice he tried to speak, but his dry lips would utter no sound. At last, with an effort, he was able to continue his statement. I'm speaking to you, Mr. Holmes. You will find out by this woman how far I am speaking the truth. And all of that, down to the word truth, is what Conan Doyle cut out. And I think, two things. I mean, one is good for him for cutting it out, because the fact that Lestrade has just identified Jonas Oldacre as a woman hater is just sort of, an asteroid from Mars. I mean, it's got nothing to do with the story. And how did he do that? And why? And what does that say to the case? But second, Sherlockians, boy, just because no rough notes of writers, I think lawyers, writers use paper and pencils like popcorn. So the idea that Conan Doyle, never made notes, never made outlines, and never sort of tried things out, and this sort of just sprung from his head, and he walked around and he thought of the story, and then with all the chaos around him, he just wrote it out perfectly. It's ridiculous. So all of this stuff was what writers do. You crumple it up and throw it away.
And one of the great things about this particular volume is that not only can you see what's crossed out in other instances Conan Doyle sometimes would, cut out something or put in an insert page, and we don't know exactly what's crossed out. But the quality of the reproduction here is such that you can see the original story was written in what looks like a fountain pen.
Probably a J pen.
Okay. And some of the crossouts are with the same fountain pen. And then there's another round of editing still in Conan Doyle's hand, which looks like it's in pencil or a much lighter pen. I think I recall it being pencil, still done by Conan Doyle before he sent the manuscript in to be typed. So maybe he put it aside and reread it the next morning. And those are more along the lines of line edits. And the quality of reproduction, and all the volumes of the Manuscript series have had great reproduction, but this one is especially fine. And you can clearly distinguish between what's in the pen and what's in the pencil, which came later.
Absolutely. And if I may add one other facet to, or one other aspect to Scott's initial insight on this, and this is one of the things that I very much enjoyed about working on this book, is just how sharp and thoughtful the authors were and how they interacted with the manuscript. And I invite you to look at footnote 12 of Sue Wysocki's essay about Mrs. Lexington, where she captures something else that's intriguing about that same crossed out passage in the book. She writes, Mrs. Lexington's identification of McFarlane is the occasion of an unfortunate error by the Strand magazine. When McFarlane is telling Holmes about his evening visit to Oldacre, Holmes interrupts. Quote, "One moment," end quote, said Holmes. Quote, "Who opened the door?" End quote. Quote, "A middle-aged woman who was, I suppose, his housekeeper." End quote. "And it was she, I presume, who mentioned your name." End quote. "Exactly," said McFarlane. And then Holmes says, "Pray proceed." Sue Wysocki then observes, McFarlane seems tentative about her being Oldacre's housekeeper. Why then is McFarlane so emphatic about her identification of him at a police interview, an interview at which he was not present? The two statements are oddly inconsistent. The solution to this puzzle is in the manuscript and in the more accurate Collier's reproduction of this passage. The, quote, "exactly," end quote, was spoken by Lestrade, not by McFarlane. There are two speakers. McFarlane was tentative about Mrs. Lexington, and Lestrade stated with certainty that Mrs. Lexington had identified McFarlane. And that fits with what Burt was saying about the way this kind of Xing out sometimes happens, is Conan Doyle correctly, as a general authorial matter, removed those paragraphs, but forgot to move Lestrade's identification up in the dialogue.
Interesting.
Thank you, Sue Wysocki.
Yeah, nice.
What a fantastic observation. I love, when we can pick out these details, these trifles, shall we say, and make something out of them that maybe we had passed over before. And Burt, I should note, in Lestrade's defense, this isn't widely known, but Lestrade and Oldacre were both members of the He-Man Woman Haters Club. I don't know if you're familiar with that organization. Makes an appearance later on in Little Rascals. Anywho, Ross, you were mentioning before wanting to have access to Conan Doyle's fire grate. Well, in this case, we actually have something even more valuable related to Norwood, the Norwood Notebook, which is now on display at the Grolier Club as part of Glenn Moranker's collection. There are some wonderful nuggets in there, plot points, shall we say, that make their appearance later on. What are a couple of those that you can bring to mind?
Well, during the course of this book, putting together this book, I talked with Glenn on a number of occasions about the Norwood Notebooks, in part because I wanted to know. First of all, of course, I would love to look at them, right? And now we've all had a chance to do that in New York, which was incredible. Just to determine whether there were actual Norwood Builder foreshadowings in the Norwood Notebooks. These are the notebooks that Conan Doyle kept his diaries and calendars that he kept during the early 1890s when he and his family lived in Norwood. And of course, this story gets written a decade later. And just to give me a sense of what was going on with this, Glenn sent me some nice images of a few of the key pages. I had no idea why he had those so readily at hand, but now we all know why he had them so readily at hand. And he gave me permission to reproduce a couple of snippets in the introduction to the Norwood Builder book. And of course, there is the classic one that we all know about, which is the line written in December of 1893, killed Holmes. But there are also all sorts of other nifty bits. For example, sometime during the early 1890s, it occurred to Conan Doyle that Holmes would be able to deduce from looking at a chewed stick what kind of dog the owner of the stick had. So we have in Holmes' deductions from a stick, St. Bernard dog. Now, this probably resurfaced a little earlier than the Norwood Builder did, because it sure sounds like the beginning of The Hound of the Baskervilles. But in rooting through all of that, we didn't find any specific Norwood Builder foreshadowings in the Norwood notebooks.
That's interesting, though, because Conan Doyle lived in Norwood, and it was after he moved down to Surrey, to Hindhead, that he used Norwood, his native soil, well, not native soil, but his old neighborhood, shall we say, in this particular case. And there's a wonderful chapter, a wonderful essay as part of this book that isn't related to the law, but that is related to Norwood, the neighborhood, and Catherine Cook of the Marylebone Library has access to the streets, the byways, the back alleys, etc., and does a wonderful job describing, the Norwood of Conan Doyle's era.
Yes, she does. And may I add something else that she does wonderfully in that chapter? She completely and perfectly and politely eviscerates a previous scholar's theory about, or pair of scholars' theory about where Jonas Oldacre's house was.
Oh, talk more about that.
Well, one of those previous writers is named Ross Davies. And the other is my longtime friend and collaborator, Cattleya Concepcion, who also contributes to this book in another way. But with respect to that, I would, with your permission, read a very, very short email exchange that I had with Catherine about this. When she sent me the chapter, I replied, of course, and I said, before I get to a small handful of comments and questions, and by the way, by small, I mean really small. It was a beautifully executed chapter from day one. I wrote, I must say that I see in this paper a bit of a pattern, which I have shared with Bob Katz. The author, meaning Catherine, enjoys tweaking the noses of her editors. I know what you did to Bob's scholarship in your chapter for Nerve and Knowledge, a book that Bob Katz and Annie Solberg edited about medicine in the canon. And she gave Bob the same treatment she gave Cattleya and me. And I see what you are doing to mine here. Your work is not questionable on the merits because you are consistently correct. And the work is not questionable on the rhetoric because you are admirably dispassionate. Or, as I strongly suspect, your sense of humor is so perfectly dry that it would defeat any counterpoint anyway. There is truly no one like you. To which she replies, in perfect character, I am so glad you like the article. Oh dear. Am I getting capital A, capital R, reputation among BSI editors? Question mark.
That's lovely. That's one of the wonderful glimpses behind the scene of the emotion, the back and forth that editors and authors have to play. And as much as we like talking about the subject matter in these wonderful books, it's wonderful to hear the storytelling that goes into the creation of them as well.
Yes, I must note though that Catherine offers no sympathy for the fact that I am sloshing around in a pool of my own scholarly blood as I'm writing this note. But yes, as we all know, a great joy of working on these things is just how nice and fun the Sherlockian enthusiasts are.
Yeah, I had written an article for Ross's Almanac last year in which I disagreed with 8 eminent prior Sherlockian writers, but all of them were deceased by that point, so I got less pushback.
A victimless crime. I love it.
Yeah. But yes, Catherine's chapter is a masterful work of scholarship. And I would also point out that Catherine, part of what makes her papers work so well, not just this one, but generally, is, yes, she's very knowledgeable and she's very deliberate, but she also does not overreach, which I think is part of what makes people like Davies and Katz such easy targets for her, right? Because at the beginning of her chapter, she correctly points out that you've got to figure out where in the chronology the Norwood Builder takes place in order to make sense of the geography that she's about to analyze. And so she discusses the chronology a little bit and points out that there are strong arguments for August 1894 and also for August 1895. How does Catherine resolve this issue? Now, if she were a rabid chronologist, and there are one or two of those, I think, in the Sherlockian world, she would take a stand and she would harness hundreds of footnotes and words of argument. Instead, she writes, I incline to 1894. Watson would have said a year if he meant more than 12 months. But 1894-1895 is a precise enough dating for our purposes. She keeps her eye on the target. Unfortunately, the target is me. The target, in fact, is figuring out what Deep Dean House is, Oldacre's house is. And then she goes through and she does this marvelously methodical or historical geographical treatment, but then she combines it with this almost thrilling reimagination of the steps that John Hector McFarlane would have taken as he hurried across Norwood in the middle of the night on that important night in question. Whether it was August 1894 or 95 doesn't really matter for her purposes. And so what is in some ways a very dry analytical piece is brought very much to life, not only by her writerly skills, but by her ability to add drama to this. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, when you look at the sum total of the essays in this book, while it has been edited by a lawyer and has involved a number of lawyers in the creation, it is not solely legally focused. As I said, geography with Catherine Cook. We've got to look at tramp life from Anastasia. We've got Mariel Caro looking at how the buttons were found in the char in the remains of the fire. Wonderful essay by Stephen McAllister about Jonas Oldacre's crimes or not. So when you put all of these together, it's a really nice balance that I think showcases the ability of Conan Doyle as a master storyteller. Sherlock Holmes is back. This is the second story in his return, and Conan Doyle is really at his top form in the return.
I agree with you. I've always thought of this as one of my favorite Holmes stories. In the conventional ratings that of the surveys that have been done from time to time, this story generally tends to run in the middle of the pack. I personally place it a little higher than that.
I would agree. There's a lot of depth to this story. He's working with a lot of different pieces in interesting ways that invite the kind of work that appears in this book. To go back to Anastasia Klimchinskaya's chapter, she taps into something that actually seems doubly powerful about this invocation of the tramp. One, she points out that there is the the representational economic context. That this story takes place at a time of great economic desperation among everyone outside of what we might think of today as the 1%. And so she's bringing in that desperate person aspect. But then she goes on to say, to focus on this other aspect of the tramp, which is as this person who is in opposition to the social order, to social norms, to civility. And she writes, to exist both within society and at its margins, to at once critique it and uphold its order. Does that not recall a certain Victorian detective possessed of a, quote, bohemian soul? Darn tootin' it does. And you got to want, again, it brings back the fireplace grate. How much of this was in Conan Doyle's mind as he was scribbling with that pen or writing neatly with that pen? Was there a smile under that mustache as he brought in the tramp for, as Anastasia points out, the only time in the entire canon?
That's a wonderful observation. Great stuff here. Well, the book is a masterpiece of villainy, edited by Ross Davies, and it is a masterpiece, as we just said. Please rush right out and get it from the BSI Press. We'll have a link to purchase the book in the show notes, along with other items that have come up in our conversation here. Make sure you check those out at ihose.co/ihose234 for all of your linked needs. Well, Ira, Ross, thank you for joining us once again here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Burt. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
You know, it's a wonderful community. You think about the names of the people who were mentioned, who've contributed essays to this terrific book. And I had that experience with my essay. I have an essay in here. And the assignment that I got was to write about how the return of Sherlock Holmes was announced and promoted, how it was revealed to the world. The idea at the time being that there was probably an advertising campaign, but the assignment came in when the pandemic was started. And one of the things I couldn't do was go to places like the Berg Library, but I got such help from Peter Blau and John Lullenberg and Catherine Cook and Kate Bromley and Professor Peter MacDonald, who's written a terrific book about publishing practice in Britain, and Sarah Obermiller Burnett, who has a great publication herself, a study in postcards about Sherlock Holmes in the golden age of the picture postcard. And and I got an enormous amount of help actually from the New York Public Library, from Paul Friedman and the research organization. The records of the Strand were largely lost, at least according to one source, during World War II. But there's quite a lot you can go searching for at the Berg, A.P. Watt records, the University of North Carolina, the University of Reading, Portsmouth. Nick Utekin was very helpful. And the funny thing about writing is, you start writing one thing, but you learn something different. You learn about what Conan Doyle thought about advertising, how P.G. Wodehouse promoted the return of Sherlock Holmes, how prominent Holmes was around that time, and how images and art excited people about Holmes's return. And that's why it's so great to see those postcards in the book. So really, really a fascinating experience. Oh, and Matthias Bostrom found all the advertising that McClure's had done in American papers when they resold the publication rights, and how the return stories were then printed and cut up and put in Sunday papers around the country. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it seems to me that McClure's was really on top of their promotions game, because remember, this is the same publisher that took the Hound of the Baskervilles manuscript and cut it up and gave a sheet to each bookseller to post in their shop window. Which is why we do not have the entire manuscript of the Hound of the Baskervilles extant anymore. We have a single chapter, which of course is at the Berg Collection, New York Public Library, and then there are sheets that are scattered here and there. And I think this is where Glenn Moranker's exhibition at the Grolier Club manages to bring all of this together. So this notion of Holmes returning first in The Hound of the Baskervilles and then returning properly in The Return. It's kind of a 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
So when you did your research, Burt, were there any surprises that you had, or were you kind of expecting things to go in one direction and they went in another?
Well, I originally expected to find some records of advertising. You know, we also went in search of W.H. Smith, the newsagent, because the newsagent in the UK did obviously a lot of sheets in advertising and promotion. And, of course, George Nunes, in his other publications, advertised The Return. So we did find that. And I did find Collier's advertising. Collier's placed some ads in the New York Times. But the idea that there was a campaign, as we would today consider a campaign about the return of Sherlock Holmes, it really, doesn't appear to have been so. The surprise, some of the surprises was to discover more about Conan Doyle's thoughts about advertising literature, which he was not in favor of. And in fact, that's how the essay starts. It starts with him spending £25 to advertise, apparently, the sale of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in book form by Nunes is going slowly. There are still thousands of copies left. And he puts £25 on the table to do some newspaper advertising, which is very successful, by the way. And then there's a second printing.
Was he seemingly of the mind that his own work should rest on its own merits and his reputation should be the lead?
No, his idea was the work should really, that A, publishers should be responsible for advertising and promoting, and B, the work should stand on its merits. And he was very offended when, he wrote letters to the Times about one particular author who spent a lot of time blowing his own horn, and this just, offended him dreadfully. He felt it was very unseemly.
Yeah, and that strikes me as very consistent with Conan Doyle's personality as we know it. A man of integrity, a man who was probably more humble than his reputation afforded him to be. He certainly had a lot to brag about, but he was a gentleman. He was not in favor of that kind of self-tooting, shall we say.
But the funny thing is, when you start writing something, the lovely thing about writing these things is, you start writing one thing and then you learn something completely different. For example, in Collier's, the month before The Return started, there was a full page advertisement with 2/3 of the page devoted to a portrait of Conan Doyle drawn by an artist with the initials WGS. And no one knows. There's some speculation that it's another artist that was in the UK whose name fits those initials, but that's not really very likely. No one knows who that artist was. And you find out that although there's a lot in A.P. Watts records in the University of North Carolina, here and there, scattered all around, you realize how much has been lost. And so you find these. You find these mysteries, and then you learn a lot. I had no idea that, for example, in the days when there would be a morning edition of a newspaper and an evening edition of a newspaper, they would take a Sherlock Holmes story from The Return, and they would print the first part of it in the morning, and then the second part of it in the evening edition, so you had to buy both papers.
It's kind of a cliffhanger for newspaper subscribers.
Yeah, and then some local papers would make it into a news story all about how much the stories cost. $40,000 for these stories. Here, in the daily, it'll be in today's town leader. You've got to see this. You're not going to believe it.
That's fantastic. Well, you learn something new every day.
One of the great Sherlockian periodicals is back, the 2021 Sherlock Holmes Review, edited by Steve Doyle, art direction by Mark Gagan, with all new contributions from Nicholas Meyer, Robert Doherty, Frank Cho, Anne Margaret Lewis, Steve Hockensmith, Les Klinger, Jimmy Aiken, and more. 118 pages about Sherlock Holmes, the illustrators, community, collecting, comics, reviews, film and TV, scholarship, including new artwork, Irene Adler, drawn by the inimitable Frank Cho. It looks like a book and reads like a magazine. It's the Sherlock Holmes Review. Get your first edition copy of this essential 2021 Sherlockian Annual, the all-new Sherlock Holmes Review, at wesexpress.com.
Of course, everyone knows those dulcet tones. That means it's time, once again, for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's Canonical Couplets, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we ask you to guess which Sherlock Holmes story we are talking about. Now, if you were around here in the last episode, you'll recall that we gave you this clue. A day's work ruined, then Watson was enthralled. One way to make a fortune, keep a medico on call. Burt, do you know which story we are talking about here?
Yes, that's a terrific story. Holmes tells Watson about an old school chum of his who has this mystery at his home, and Holmes travels out there and discovers the lost recipe for a very spicy old English condiment. That's the story Watson called The Mustard Victual.
Oh, boy. Well, no, I'm sorry.
No?
That is, surprisingly enough, that is not the correct answer. And we did have an entry once again. Our old faithful Eric Deckers just came in under the wire. He said, I hope I'm not too late. I was distracted by the superb owl. Oh, excuse me, the Super Bowl. But I do have the answer. It's the story of the factory owner from the Balkans whose reckless disregard for safety saw many a worker lose a finger or an entire hand during the work. It's the negligent Croatian. Wait, Eric says, I may have been celebrating a little too much this weekend. Go Barn Owls. But the answer is more likely the resident patient. Ah, yes, Eric, that is what we were looking for, the resident patient. You and Burt, I don't know, you're something of a breed of sorts. Well, let's see. We had a few entries, not too many last time. Maybe other people were distracted by the superb owl as well. But let's take the ones that we do have and give the prize wheel a big spin. Watching it go around, and it's coming to rest on number 8, and that corresponds to Bruce Harris. Hey, Bruce, congratulations. We will be getting you a piece of, I guess it's a historical Sherlockian scholarship, something related to the last episode, which was with Vincent Rice and that early Sherlockian scholarship. So something exciting from the IHO's vaults. So stay tuned for that. Now, I promised people that in this episode we would have something exciting for you in the way of a prize, and we do indeed. We have a copy of the BSI Press book, A Masterpiece of Villainy. This is a really valued prize, valued at $39.95 actually, and we will be getting this off to the lucky person who answers this canonical couplet. A Vesta buried in the mud, it had been a rainy night. Had the inspector imagination, he could rise to greater heights. If you know the answer to this week's canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose you at random, you'll win. Good luck. Well, that should be a nice prize, a BSI Press book.
Yeah.
Very good. With a work by Burt Wolder inside, making it even more valuable.
Reducing its value to $34.95.
We'll even make you pay for the postage. No, it will arrive at your doorstep after we get your answers. So that'll be great. We do have a number of exciting guests coming up here in the weeks ahead. Of course, we drop these on the 15th and the 30th of every month. So I can't wait for which episode is going to drop on February 30th, Bert.
Me neither. I think we should just stop until February 30th comes around, don't you?
Oh, that's an idea. Yeah, if you would like us to produce another show this February, write in and tell us so. The email is comment@ihearofsherlock.com. And, of course, we have a reconstituted call-in line. I didn't mention that at the top of the show, but it is 5-1895-221B-5. So 1895 221B, bookended by a 5 on either end. Isn't that a cool phone number?
Very cool.
I wish we had gotten this years ago and been consistent in our efforts. But hey, 16th season's charm, they say. Who says that? No one says that.
No one says that.
Oh, but what we do say around these parts is, until next time, I remain the telephonically connected Scott Monty.
And I am still receiving telegrams at burtwolder.usa.
And together we say, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.